The other standout of the colonial period is definitely John Singleton Copley, who is from Boston and learned to make art from his stepfather, who was a printmaker, but who died when Copley was 13, and that forced him to create portraits to help earn money to support his family. And he very quickly became one of the most popular portrait painters in Boston. One thing that was different about him is that he tended to show a little bit more of a sitter's social class, and he was also very interested in showing their work or their trade in life. But I think what really was masterful in the work of Copley was the way he rendered surface texture. So if you just look at this painting, which is called Henry Pelham, it's his stepbrother, or Boy with the Squirrel from 1765, notice that there's this beautiful sheen on the hair, the texture of the skin in contrast to the silk collar and the velvet jacket, the way that the wood shimmers, the fur of the small squirrel, the glass of water, all of it shows this real beautiful mastery of surface texture in painting. This work is also interesting because Copley submitted it to an exhibition in London so that he could get a sense of what his reception would be in Europe. And Benjamin West, who we just met recently and was now president of the Royal Academy, reported that the work was actually quite well received and encouraged Copley to leave the colonies and come to Europe, where he could have a much greater career as an artist, and he could get away from simply painting portraits and create historical works. So not only is this a demonstration piece to kind of test the waters and see what the reception would be in Europe, but it's also been interpreted as a metaphorical painting. And if you think about what's happening in 1765 and the growing tensions between Great Britain and the colonists who are beginning to want their independence, this Native American flying squirrel that the little boy has on a leash is interesting. In fact, we've seen this squirrel motif before. We saw it in a painting of Deborah Hall by William Williams. But the way it's been interpreted here is that it may be a metaphor for the way that Great Britain has the colonists literally on a chain. Or it could also be interpreted as the colonists who have the Native Americans in an equally submissive role. So Copley doesn't tell us for sure, but there are multiple interpretations on the idea of this leashed squirrel. Another great example of his portraits while still in the colonies is this one of American Revolutionary War hero Paul Revere, who before he became a hero of the American Revolution was just a regular guy who was a printmaker and also a silversmith. So this is classic colonial portraiture, where you see not just the sort of intimacy of the portrait and the man himself, but you see him with this kind of pride of craftsmanship, where we see his work. We know that he's a silversmith because he holds this beautiful silver teapot, which even shows the reflection on the underside of his fingers, and we see the tools of the trade. And again, I think, if you walk into a museum and you just look at portraits, not looking at the artist's name, you'd probably be able to identify Copley simply by the beautiful texture, the reflective quality that stands out from so many other colonial American painters. He also did this portrait of Governor and Mrs. Thomas Mifflin. Mifflin was a wealthy merchant in Philadelphia. He was also a member of the First Continental Congress. And what's interesting is that we see his wife, Sarah, working on threads of silk that were being used to make fringes for carriage whips. And the fact that she's doing work, that she is helping to make something, suggests the importance of the role of colonial women in producing goods so that they could avoid having to accept imported and taxed products from Great Britain. So this may reference the fact that a lot of the colonists are beginning to boycott British goods and are doing their part to make things themselves. Now, when Copley leaves the colony, so one could say that these are fairly subdued and understated portraits, right? There's nothing extravagant. I think you can see a marked difference when John Singleton Copley paints his family. This, by the way, is his father-in-law. That's Copley himself, and this is his wife and his children. in Britain, where there is no longer this need to make things look austere and modest, but it's quite lavish. We see how well dressed they are. We see the children's toys thrown there on the floor, the beautiful fabric of the sofa, and this glorious landscape that's off in the background. So one of the things that Copley was liberated from when he got to Britain was that he no longer had to show so much restraint, which was a popular way of portraying individuals in the colonial world. But he was also frustrated with portraiture and wanted to create historical works. So he was very pleased when he got this commission from a London merchant, a man called Brooke Watson, who asked him to do a portrait of sorts, but highlight this really historically relevant moment in Brooke Watson's life. So this is Brooke Watson down here. And what happened was that he was swimming as a young man in Havana Harbor. This happened in his life in 1749. And while he was swimming, he was attacked by a shark, and he was rescued on the third attempt, but lost his leg. So he does this, he shows this, dramatic moment where a shark is coming to attack him, and this group of figures who form kind of a pyramid are each having a hand in trying to rescue him. What's also really interesting is that there are lots of metaphors for the colonies. You'll see images shortly of Britain losing an arm or a leg, suggesting that the colonies are like an extension of Britain, and without the central body, the colonies will cease to exist. So there is a kind of metaphor here of, the fact that he loses his leg to the fact that the British Empire is about to lose their significant stronghold in colonial America. It's also interesting that there is a figure of African descent who's quite central in the painting and who is almost at the top of the triangle, which generally shows a hierarchical position. What we know, although we don't have the identity of this individual, is that he was obviously an actual person in life. You can tell based on this sketch that Copley did earlier that he has sketched this from an actual model. But what's also interesting about this, and what we think his relevance is in this painting, is that Brooke Watson was a Tory, and he had noted in British Parliament the hypocrisy of the other political party, the Whigs, who supported the American revolutionaries' desire for freedom, while at the same time they were denying freedom to the African slaves. So his inclusion may be a reference to the fact that Brooke Watson, who commissioned the painting, was very much against slavery and had argued about that in Parliament.